Sunset Crater Visitor Centre was shocked to its very core when a woman frantically pushed the doors open and ran up to the front desk. She just stumbled across a body near her campsite. A woman with her hands bound with tape and some of her clothes missing was dead. And when investigators arrived, they found drag marks near her body, indicating that she'd been placed there by someone and just left out in the open Arizonian heat. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes on YouTube and as a podcast version, available in the description box down below. Sasha Krause was living on the Light and Lamp compound, where light and lamp are spelled out in painted white rocks on the hillside. I say compound because that's what it is described as in many of the sources that I use for this episode, but it's actually not a compound. It's not gated or walled in or anything like that. People are free to come and go as they please, and visitors are welcomed, but specifically only on Sundays to church. The community had less than 100 people living there, and it was small, so everyone knew everyone. Sasha herself was devoted to the church. She'd been baptised aged 12 and never really known anything other than being a Mennonite. Her family were new to the Mennonite community, and Sasha had moved from Texas to Farmington in 2018 to work for the publishing ministry. And by all accounts, she had been welcomed in and really did enjoy her day-to-day life. Sasha was a fluent speaker of Spanish, and as the ministry was always outreaching to Spanish speakers, she got the job straight away. And Sasha's skills didn't stop there. She was also learning French, and she enjoyed writing poems and hymns. On the 18th of January 2020, Sasha had gone shopping with her friend Lily. They'd gone out to go and buy her a new bed. The pair came home, they unpacked it, and they made it together in their shared trailer space. Now after that, another friend, Lucinda, came round and they all chatted before Lily and Sasha settled down to have dinner. Sasha finished up and told Lily that she was going to go to the church to pick up Sunday school material for the following day. This wasn't her usual routine. She was actually substituting for one of the other women, and she wanted to make sure that she was fully prepared and ready for that day. The last time Sasha was seen alive was at 7 p.m. when she left. Now usually she would just walk the short distance to the church, but because it was cold and it was dark, she had decided to take the car. And Lucinda had made sure that she left the lights on for when she went to bed so that Sasha would be able to see them and get back inside very easily. But when she woke up at a little after 1:30 a.m, she noticed that all of those lights were still on. And so she got Lily, her other friend, and they checked Sasha's bed, but they found that it was empty. And so she texted Sasha to ask where she was, but she waited and waited and got no response. And this was extremely worrying to her. 10:30 p.m. is the time that they're supposed to be in their rooms and, in their words, be quiet. Sasha knew this, and not returning home was completely out of the ordinary for her. And so both of her friends at this point are very worried, and they head down to the church to check it out. But as soon as they arrive there, they could see that Sasha's car was parked outside near the sidewalk, but Sasha was nowhere to be found. The pair began to alert the community, and by 3 a.m, a search party was in full swing. Sasha had left behind her wallet and her car, so she could not be far away if she'd left on her own. But it was blindingly clear, even at this early stage, that there was no way Sasha had left on her own, and there was no way Sasha had left with free will. The Mennonite community pulled together and they called 911 to report Sasha as missing. And over the next few days and weeks, and even up to 4 weeks, there were a number of leads, but nothing actually led to Sasha. One member of the Mennonite community said that they'd seen an unknown car parked at 7 p.m. outside the church, and they noticed this was odd because as I said, there's only 100 people that live there and everyone knows everyone. And to see this odd car that they didn't know really seemed out of place. But because it was dark, this woman couldn't really give any kind of a good or detailed description other than it being a foreign to her car. It was dark. The car itself was dark and she didn't have any more details. It was on the 22nd of February 2020 that a woman called Cynthia was at Sunset Crater National Park. Now, she had parked her van nearby to this sort of makeshift camp just off of a lonely 2-lane road that cut through the canyons and groves of these tall pine trees, very idyllic. And so she was there and she was just gathering wood to make a fire to prepare for this incoming sort of bout of grim weather when she saw something white in the distance. And she noticed it because it stuck out against the black volcanic cinders and the dry pine needles. It was clearly not supposed to be there. Her first thought was that it was just a plastic bag. There was a fair amount of rubbish gathered around the area, so that didn't seem like it could be too far away from the truth. But as she got closer, she saw that there was actually someone lying on the ground, face down. And she quickly made her way to this person and realised that the woman was not moving. And in fact, she looked like she had been there for quite some time. Cynthia attempted to figure out what was going on and she called out to this person, trying to get their attention. But it became clear pretty much immediately that this woman was dead and had been for some time. And so Cynthia raced to a nearby visitor centre and she told the staff that she had seen legs and shoes and knew that the person there was not alive and they needed to come straight away. When police arrived, they determined that the victim had been shot once in the head and that was likely how she died, although they would need to conduct a thorough post-mortem to be sure. The victim also had her hands tied together and they could see that she was wearing a grey dress, a white sweatshirt and some hiking shoes. And she also had her hair in a low bun with some clips in it. She did have a bra on, but her underwear was missing. And although further forensic testing would occur, they found that there were no signs of sexual assault and that there were also no defensive wounds found. It wasn't long before the deceased body was linked to the missing persons case, and that body was of course identified to be belonging to Sasha Krause. The puzzling thing was that Sasha's body was located in this Sunset National Crater Park over 400 miles away from where she'd gone missing from. They also found Sasha's phone, which would prove invaluable in helping link the killer with Sasha. Now, there weren't actually any messages or calls of note, but what the investigating team did find was a sort of set of data that placed one device alongside Sasha's, travelling a great distance. Looking at all of the unique devices in Farmington, Four Corners and Flagstaff, and alongside Sasha's, they found that there was just one other device that hit the same cell towers in the exact same time periods. Now, that phone that hit all of those specific points was registered to a man called Mark Gooch. He was a member of the military who was working at an Air Force base in Arizona. And he had lived on a dairy farm in Gleason with his family when he was growing up. And the family had joined the Mennonite religious community much later than most people. Mennonites are a specific faith stream of Christianity. They originated in the 1600s and they have a modest dress code. And Mark, in this case, describes Mennonites as often similar to Amish. There are strict rules like women often being required to wear head coverings and generally technology isn't allowed. Mark's father actually said that they don't have TVs in order to make sure to not, quote, bring the filth in. Obviously, like any community, the sort of level of strictness and discipline varies from community to community. Some people will have cars and mobile phones, but often as was the case with 27-year-old Sasha Krause, the phone would be basic, quite old, and probably only able to make phone calls or at the very most text. And so Mark's family had joined the Mennonite community much later than most people. They weren't born into it. And so according to Mark and his two brothers, Jacob and Sam, they always felt a little bit like outsiders. Things became tense between their family and the rest of the community. And by the time that the brothers were reaching sort of older teen years and into adulthood, they decided that they wanted to live like other people, like what he saw as normal people. He didn't want to be a part of this Mennonite community. It was this, alongside a number of bad choices made, that Mark decided to leave that community altogether, the community that he had ultimately grown up in. And it is, I think, important to clarify that this Mennonite community that Mark had grown up in wasn't the same as Sasha. It was just the same religion, but they were in different areas. They had different kinds of community values, and so they were not linked before this crime. Mark's former pastor told officers that Mark had a troubled past when it came to the church and the church that he looked after. When Mark was angry, he would take it out on people he thought had quote-unquote wronged him. One time, he broke into and robbed the local Mennonite family shop, but the camera had its memory card stolen, and so there actually wasn't enough evidence to press charges or convict Mark at the time. Mark had previously stolen things from the church, and when he was found out and the church ultimately tried to take action, Mark's family felt it was unfair and as if they were being overly harsh on Mark. And this is actually why the family ended up leaving the church and moving elsewhere. They very clearly did not want to set boundaries with their son. And so the parents, as well as the other members of the family, left the church. But Mark's criminal tendencies continued on even after the family left. Mark did leave the family home, and he actually ended up moving in with one of his other siblings, a sister, in Pennsylvania. He attended the local Mennonite church, but soon enough he was accused of stealing from there as well. And suddenly, for everyone who had accused Mark of stealing, their cars suspiciously stopped working. And when they looked into why this had happened, all of them found that there was sand in the oil pan of their cars, and that caused them to stop working. Now, obviously everyone knew that it was Mark that had done this, but they just couldn't prove it. And so there were no official criminal charges filed, not because they didn't know, but simply because they just didn't have the evidence. Back to the present day, and the more Mark's family and friends were being questioned, the more of his past behaviour came out. One of Mark's friends, Galen, was questioned by police, and he spoke about how Mark had allegedly confessed that he had assaulted a young girl his sister was babysitting one time when he was somewhere between the ages of around 10 to 13 years old. Now, back when Mark and his brothers were still part of the Mennonites, he began to completely and actually actively rebel against the community. He obviously committed these robberies, he stole things from people that he knew and was friends with. But he would always make sure to use gloves so that he would never leave any fingerprints or DNA at the crime scenes. He's incredibly thorough in his planning and his execution. And after this, Mark joined the military, something that it was known to be totally out of the question for someone who followed Mennonite values. If there was any need for force within any line of work, so that would include the military, it would include police officers as well, then that would be out of the question. And when speaking on Mennonite behaviour and violence with regards to defending yourself, if you ever needed to do that, Mark's own dad essentially said that there was never a call for violence. Quote, "Better my life to be sacrificed than to have someone die and be condemned to hell by my hands." And so Mark was brought in for questioning, and the detective began by generally asking about his life and about his work. And Mark confirmed that he had 6 siblings, 3 sisters, 3 brothers, and he was the youngest. And he also spoke about his Christian household, specifically Mennonite. And then the detective asks Mark if he's heard about the recent murder of Sasha Krause, to which he says yes. And she then asks him to tell her exactly, if anything, what he knows about the case. Mark replies that based on the news reports, he knew she was from Mexico and that she had just left home one evening and then they found her in this flagstone area. And when asked why he thinks the detective is wanting to talk to him, he says probably because he was travelling in that same area. The detective confirms that his car was seen on a number plate recognition system in the same area as Sasha's phone had been. And on top of that, his car was seen in New Mexico, picked up again on a number plate reader on the day that Sasha disappeared. And that is when Mark actually does admit to having been in New Mexico, despite having said just moments earlier that he hadn't really been travelling recently at all. Once he realised his vehicle had placed him in that area, he started to explain why he'd been there. He said that he was travelling up to Flagstaff to go and visit this ski resort, but he said he never stayed there because it had been closed because of COVID. Now, this is back in early 2020, so COVID restrictions were just starting to kick off around that time, and it's certainly plausible that could have been the case. After that, he went on to Farmington to go and see some friends or some family who he knew who lived up that way, who were involved with the church. He couldn't remember who the family member was or the friend was that he went to visit. At 2 p.m, he arrived at the church. He saw outside there was a sign of service times, so he didn't actually speak to anyone. And then he quickly headed back to Air Force Base because he said he wanted to be back before it got dark. He said it was a direct drive back to base with no stops, except maybe for fuel. But the detective was not buying it. She had been out to the church herself and she knew that there were no signs with the church service times on it. The only way Mark would have known about the service times was by talking to someone. And Mark had said he had decided to go up to Farmington to go and visit the church after realising that this ski resort in Flagstaff was closed because of COVID. As far as he was concerned, it was not a planned trip, more one of convenience. But, and I don't know how he thought he was going to get away with this, but the investigating team obviously can check to verify whether this ski resort was closed or not. And they learned that although that resort was eventually closed because of COVID, that is not something that happened for months after his visit in January. And so it was easily disproven. He had outright lied to the detective interviewing him. And the detective had information and actual evidence that directly contradicted what he was saying. So she pushed. She asked him for the details and times of his journeys that day. And Mark stated that he had left Luke Air Force Base in the early morning, sometime around 7 a.m, before eventually stopping in Flagstone to get fuel. After that, he drove on to Farmington to get more fuel before getting to the church. He said that it was around 2 p.m. when he got to the church to find out exactly when those planned services were. And he confirmed that there was no one around and he did not speak to anyone. But he did call his friend Kemper Kepfley to see if he wanted to go on a hike the following day. And that's the friend that he said he had to get back for. After that phone call, Mark started heading back home, and he is a little bit scatty here, he pauses for a long time and he can't quite remember if he went to scout for a hiking location or if he just headed straight back towards Luke Air Force Base. He states he probably got home around 9 p.m. and he didn't stop off anywhere on the way home. At the very most, he could have stopped for more fuel, but he didn't know for sure. On further prodding by the detective, Mark says that he could have gotten home around 2 a.m. at the latest. This 2 a.m. is a world away from the 9 p.m. he'd originally stated, and the detective knows exactly what time he got home. There is CCTV evidence, and it was 6:53 a.m. that following morning. So she tells him this, and surprise, surprise, he has an excuse for it. He says that he stopped because he was feeling tired and just fell asleep in his car. With this, the detective then asks, other than that time he just said about, had he ever gone to Flagstaff? To which Mark said no. But the detective knows that he has. He has been there in the days after the murder. And she says that, asking him to explain why he would have been there. Mark just tries to shrug it off. It's so clear that he is used to getting his own way by just sort of shrugging things off and making excuses. He says he just possibly went for a drive, but again, he couldn't remember. Mark actually made a trip out to Sunset Crater on January 21st at 5:43 p.m. and he stayed there for 20 minutes or so before eventually heading back to base. Now, at that location at Sunset Crater, that is the exact place where Sasha's body was found, and he couldn't really give a reason for being there. Phone records showed that Mark and his brother, Sam, spoke a total of 6 times for over 2.5 hours, and this behaviour was very unusual for them. Mark did mention early on in the interview that he was probably closest to Sam out of all of his siblings, but he wasn't particularly close to any of them because they'd all moved away from each other. And so at the most, Sam and Mark would talk very occasionally on the phone, but for a few minutes. So 2.5 hours of phone conversation was very out of the ordinary. And Mark couldn't explain what they'd spoken about at all. The evidence found on Mark's phone, which was eventually confiscated, was very telling. The hate for the Mennonite community ran much deeper than just Mark. His older brother, Jacob, who used to be a state trooper, and towards the beginning of COVID, sometime in April 2020, he had been assigned to patrol in Virginia's Fairfax division. He had allegedly texted his brothers saying that he'd pulled over a Mennonite man and given him a ticket before coughing on him, quote, so he would spread corona to the wedding they were going to, LOL. Mark replied, quote, fuck yes, I hope you treated them like shit.
Your brother Jake, the police officer, indicates he just gave a Mennonite a ticket. This is a group text, right, to you and Mark Gooch?
Correct.
And what was Mark Gooch's response?
Fuck yes.
Fuck yes, and how many exclamation marks?
4.
All right, and then what's his next text from Mark Gooch?
I hope you treated M like shit.
I didn't hear you. I hope you treated what?
I hope you treated M like shit, EM.
Thank you. What was your response?
Haha, hell yeah. Tell them the VA state police doesn't like cultists.
All right, and then Jake Gooch talks about coughing. Can you read that?
I coughed on him so he would spread corona to the wedding they were going to, LOL.
And what was Mark's response?
Aha, that's fucking hilarious.
More evidence showed that just a week before Sasha was murdered, Mark's mobile phone had pinged off of a cell tower near a different Mennonite church, this time in Phoenix. And Mark had texted Sam asking what he was doing today, to which Sam replied, quote, making some breakfast, might do some cleaning, bored as fuck. Mark replies, same for some reason. Even this morning's surveillance was boring. Bunch of old people without much left to live for, and clearly not the Mennonite people we grew up with. Sad to say, another disappointment. Sam replies, I wish I was out by you. We'd find something to do or some shit to get into. Why is Mark surveilling Mennonite people? He and Sam have very obviously spoken about this a lot for it to be in a sort of normal conversation and not bring up any further questions. It certainly feels sinister and as though it's clearly said in a negative way. Clearly, the 3 siblings held some kind of extreme and intense judgment against Mennonites. After his phone was confiscated by police, they found a file on it from an SD card that, when they watched it, they saw it was some kind of CCTV footage. And it showed someone fitting Mark's description, but with a hood up and face partially covered. It showed him robbing that Mennonite shop, the one where it had been suspected that Mark had been the perpetrator, but it could never be proven because the SD card from the camera had been stolen. The footage also tracks him going outside and getting into a car that also fit Mark's vehicle description. Police even spoke to one of Mark's friends, a known petty crime partner, Jared Ulrich, and they had found a number of deleted text messages on Mark's phone that led them to Jared. And he confessed to having been involved with Mark in many of the robberies that he'd committed. And he also told them that Mark liked to try and frame others in the Mennonite community for the crimes. The forensic testing of the phone found that Mark had texted Sam, "Do you know if Jared has a pin on his phone?" Jared claimed that he deletes all text messages from me, but I doubt it. Can you remote wipe Jared's phone? And Sam replied, quote, "I'll check Jared's Google history when I get home, and if there's no activity in a few days, I'll wipe his phone." How does Sam have the ability to do this? He must be good at hacking, or at least have extensive technical knowledge. More evidence came from Mark's data, including that on the 28th and 29th of January, he had searched for the Farmington police Facebook page. And then on the 2nd of February, he had searched that specific Facebook page for an article about Sasha Krause. He also deleted his Google account location history on the 19th of January, straight after he returned from his big road trip. And then again, after he returned from his second trip to Sunset Crater, and once more the day after Sasha's body was discovered. There were even receipts found for Mark having his car detailed and cleaned the day after Sasha's murder, and he'd bought bleach at the same time. Meanwhile, police were questioning a number of people who knew Mark, and his friend, Kemper Kepfley, who we've spoken about earlier, he spoke about how Mark secretly kept a gun on base for months, but recently he'd given it to his other pal Jeremiah, who lived off base and had asked him to look after it. Now, Sam had reached out to Jeremiah, and police had actually been able to listen in on this phone call, and it showed Sam making plans to go to Arizona to get rid of the gun before police came to find it, in his words. But of course, what Sam didn't know was that Jeremiah had already handed the gun over to the police, and it had already gone for forensic testing. And that forensic testing found it to be the same caliber as the bullet that had killed Sasha. With that, and on police instruction, Jeremiah did arrange to meet up with Sam so that he could give him the gun, but because police were in on it, they'd obviously taken the gun and they'd given him a sort of replica of this gun so that the exchange could still take place. As soon as Jeremiah gave the replica to Sam, he shook his hand, put it in his car, and then went to drive off. What Sam obviously didn't know was that the police were recording and watching his every move. As soon as they saw he had the replica gun in his possession, they made their move and they arrested him. In Sam's interrogation, he started by playing completely unaware of anything that was going on. He's quite manipulative as well. This is a quote from him. "I don't think this is going to be a proactive conversation for me." We don't know exactly what Sam did or didn't know. It's definitely possible that Mark told Sam the police suspected him for this murder and convinced Sam that he didn't do it, but he needed his help in, I don't know, getting rid of things that could be used against him in the future, like the gun, for example. But of course, and this is certainly the way I lean, it is possible that Mark told Sam exactly what had happened, and then Sam agreed to help him cover it up. We just don't know. It's probably important to say as well that in a very odd kind of coincidence, one of Mark's older brothers had actually attended a Bible school with Sasha many, many years ago in Texas. And this brother, and I'm sorry I couldn't find out if it was Jacob or Sam, but this brother had even gone on to have dinner at Sasha's family home one time. This lead was looked into, but it was found to just be a very odd coincidence and nothing to do with the subsequent abduction and murder. There was ample evidence against Mark in this case, and so it went to trial, where even more evidence was presented, including a good friend of his, Alex, who he'd trained in the military with. Now, Alex had previously been interviewed, and he'd said that Mark had told him he would be happy to be paid for killing people, specifically within combat. Now, Alex said that he didn't take this too seriously because it was sort of said in passing, and that he was talking about the, quote, enemy. Either way, it was clear that Mark had violence within him, and it looks as though Sasha was a victim that Mark was looking for. He would have attacked anyone from the Mennonite community, probably though he was looking for a woman. But Sasha was very sadly in the wrong place at the wrong time. More evidence was presented, including that Mark had his car detailed on the 23rd of February, which was one day after the police had announced to the public that Sasha's body had been found. And in that car, actually, they did find a pair of black gloves with these suspicious stains on them that were then taken for forensic testing. And finally, all of the phone evidence was also presented, including that Mark had deleted a number of files and documents from his Google account. There were deleted texts with Sam, including one speaking about needing to get his car really well cleaned. Ultimately, Mark was convicted of kidnap and first-degree murder, and he was given a life sentence. And for his brother's involvement, Sam was given 3 years probation for attempting to help cover up his brother's crimes. After the sentencing, Sasha's mum spoke about how special Sasha was. She was intelligent and funny, often taking on the role of mother for her siblings, as her mum had battled postnatal depression and Sasha could see that she needed support. The responsibility she took on made her who she became, a determined, kind and resilient individual. Educating children brought her pure joy, and by the time she was an adult, she was not only a daughter to her parents, but in her mum's words, she was also a friend. As we know, I mentioned that Sasha was a talented poet, and her mum decided to share with the world the last thing she ever wrote. Quote, "When stress and fear take their toll, when cruel tyrants grasp my soul, when death and all its horrors roll, I shall not walk alone." I'll see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.